In the endeavor to divide our Avesta texts into originals and gloss, we are greatly added by the meter. Interpolated words and phrases are often obvious at a glance, and we should never suspend our efforts to discover all the traces of meter which exist in the Avesta as a necessary step to the restoration of the documents to the first form, but we should avoid exaggeration and a careless dogmatic procedure in insisting upon reducing lines to an exact or supposed exact number of syllables. And let me flip over here. It's only lately that the variation from 11 to 12 syllables in the lines of Trishtup has been applied to the Gathic meters, nor has the possibility of shifting Kasura been acceded to lately. I regard it as unwise to suppose that the metrical lines of the Vesta are, indeed, of any very ancient poetical matter, have been composed with every line filled in exact proportions. The ancient poets would have brought out the measures in many a place by accident, and a sonde which are no longer known to us. The Vedic hymns may to a great extent form an exception, but who would not say that where uniform evenness is at hand, an effort to improve the meter has often corrupted the text? Priests are reciters of intelligence, would here and there round off an awkward strophe, as year after year they felt the unevenness of numbers. Meter must inevitably bring a perfecting corruption at times, as a deficiency in the meter must also prove a marring corruption. Cases should be carefully discriminated. The expression of passionate feeling, for instance, would be likely to cause unevenness in lines. The language would be vigorous and idiomatic, and of unusual value as a fragment of the ancient phrase, but the meter would have suffered. Now we're talking about, we have priestcraft, really. If it's revealed or inspired, then it can't be edited. Perhaps translated from one thing to other and compiled from different sources, and it seems maybe the Vestan isn't the first language that some of this was written in, but are passed on in. There's reasons to think that, but there's a difference between a poet and a prophet. Then as to conjectured texts, after texts have been improved from all available relics of ancient tradition or scholarship, as afforded by the Pahlavi translations, and from the evidence of meter, we are at times still left with readings before us which could not have been original. The composers have indeed here and there constructed sentences which they either could not or would not make easy, but as a general thing, we may say that where the text as it stands gives no satisfactory sense to us, after we have exhausted the resources of previous Asiatic scholarship, our direct analogy, and our efforts to explain it, it is, in that case, not the text as the composer delivered it, but we are then reduced to conjecture, for how are we to translate a text before we are certain that it is integral? Our first efforts should be directed to the detection of losses, for a text may still be of great value when considered as a mass of broken sentences, for if we are certain that such is its character, sorry about the squeak, character, we can often fill out the missing members with much probability. But whether we insert supplementary conjectures or merely bracket later interpolations, we must by all means, in cases of real necessity, make the effort to amend the text, as also in the Veda. Even if we fail in our attempted improvements, we are often a little worse off than before, from whence it is possible or even probable that the composers wrote what we suggest. It it is sometimes not possible that they wrote exactly what stands in our texts. We should even suggest alternative readings where our present ones are only less probable, for the suggestion of an alternative is not the wholesale destruction of a sentence, while even while we declare their outcoming meaning totally unsatisfactory, the manuscripts still remain to other writers to begin on afresh, and in estimating what would be reasonable meanings, we should guard carefully against both extremes, and we should especially exercise a strong negative criticism against the recognition of too much meaning, or too subtle a meaning, profound and subtle conceptions placed where we are obliged to place. The Gathas and other ancient portions of the Avesta are indeed precious relics, as such conceptions at any age show a higher mental power, but we must doubt them only so much the more, and doubt if we would be scientific and conscientious, till doubt becomes no longer possible. Beyond that, we should turn our suspicions against our doubts themselves, which is the proper course if we would exhaust the meanings of the Gathas, unless there are a fortuitous concourse of syllables, religiously profound modes of thought are manifest throughout. It is therefore strictly unscientific to force parts of them to express shallow details, and it is above all deplorable to change the text itself in order to produce out of it less enlarged meanings. I say, to force parts of them, for the great mass of them confessively defies all attempts to reduce them to the statements of simple commonplace. Non-specialists must not suppose that our texts are more apparently uncertain than many portions of the Old Testament. Well, I would say when it comes to the Vesta, there's probably even more uncertainty about that. And it seems less to be reworking of other stuff than even the Old Testament. Large portions of them are also as clear, at least, as the Rig Veda. And the emendations referred to need very seldom affect the doctrines. Let the learned public, however, insist on scholars making attempts to render the texts as they stand before their emendations, and greater harmony would result. They can never possess the rich color of the bricks. It is therefore the more to be deplored if we fail to see their deep but awkwardly expressed and oft repeated thought. I must express my regret that until lately, when the encletics have been more carefully considered, the form of sentences in the Gathas does not seem to have been noticed, writers conjecturing infinitives and simple accusatives at the ends of sentences. Both may, of course, fall there, but when we wish to reconstruct a word, we should not change it to a form which is not placed according to the prevailing analogies. Infinitives and accusatives generally, before in the Gathas and in the Rig Veda, avoid the end of the sentence. The accusative, when it falls there, qualifying word, is generally preceded by qualifying words in opposition or agreements with it. Also, in the conception of translations, authors seem to suppose it impossible that the lines can contain anything but lengthened prosaic statements, too often with an accusative or infinitive pushed awkwardly out to this end. To me, the Gathic sentence is very often short, so better adapted to poetic expression. It has been already implied, and it has been taken for granted throughout, that the Avesta should be closely compared with the Veda. But let it never be forgotten, in the name of science, that the force and meaning of analogous words in the Gathic and the Vedic cannot be expected to be uniformly identical, considering the extent of territory and the length of time which those who spoke the two languages were separated. Some things have the opposite meaning but sound like the same word, right? Chiefs, okay. The meanings of the Vedic words could not hold their own even in India, developing into Sanskrit and Prakrit and Pali, right? Or is Pali Prakrit, which differ widely. How truly misguided it is, therefore, to attribute necessarily the same shades of meaning to the terms of the two sister tongues. Yeah, people go even further with modern etymology, which is not really. Even if the Gathic hymns stood in the Indian forms and had been discovered in India, having also reference to Indian history, no thoughtful writer would have rendered them in complete analogy with the Rig Veda. The Gathic usages would have been added in our dictionaries to those of the Vedic, just as the Sanskrit definitions are added. An additional word seems to be called for as to the results of the Zarathustrian theology, because its connection with the modern philosophy through Gnosticism, which has already been noticed. A relation between it and Jewish theology since the captivity has long been mentioned. The hagiology, the demonology, the temptation, parables, the eschatology have all been supposed to show traces of the time when Persian power was dominant in Jerusalem, and with it Persian literature, but the discussion of such questions requires separate treatises. Historical Judaism really can't be said to have occurred before. You really can't call. You don't see Judaism before 540 BCE, and really about 108. The second book of Maccabees is when you first find something called Judaism. Well, a little bit different sounding word, but As to the general benefit which has resulted from Zarathustrianism in the past, few reflections need to be added. If the mental illumination and spiritual elevation of many millions of mankind throughout long periods of time are of any importance, it would require strong proof to deny Zarathustrianism has had an influence of very positive power in determining the gravest results, that men should be taught to look within rather than without, to believe that suffering, hardship, and sin do not originate from the capricious power of a deity still called good, that the good thought, word, and deed should be recognized as essential to all sanctity, even in the presence of a, superstitious means surviving, ceremonial, that a judgment should have been expected according to the deeds done in the body, and that the soul, consigned to a heaven of virtue, are to a hell of vice, its recompense being pronounced by the happy or stricken consciousness. These can never be regarded by serious historians as matters of little moment, and, on the contrary, if they are allowed to be matters of great moment, the Zend Avesta should be revered and studied by all who value the records of the human race. And I don't need to read off the abbreviations. I don't need to, but the next part is the Gathas.